Welcome back to Emma's Pearls. Today we have Casey Griffiths with us, and of course David Denning, and we are going to talk about the Kirtland Bank. I don't know a lot about it. I just know that it was a huge controversy back then. So, Casey, do you want to kind of explain what went on?
Yeah, the official name is the Kirtland Safety Society, and you could argue that it is the kind of spark that lights the biggest apostasy in the early church. It causes a lot of problems in and around Kirtland, and eventually results in a significant portion of the church leaving. Several prominent general authorities leave. Some of them come back. But the bottom line is that it's the basic reason why the church has to abandon Kirtland as a meaningful center for the church, and that results in us losing the Kirtland Temple, which the church doesn't get back until 2024. So the ramifications echo even into our day, where it's just been within the last 2 years that we've regained ownership over the Kirtland Temple. Well, what happened is when the saints abandoned Kirtland, they had to leave the temple behind, obviously, and the temple sort of changed hands, went into receivership. Eventually, Community of Christ, which was at the time known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, gets back to Kirtland before us, and there's a big lawsuit over which church actually owns the temple, which the results of that lawsuit are still in dispute. But the bottom line was a judge ruled that since Community of Christ was occupying the building and had been occupying it for about 20 years at that point, they were ruled as the owners, and they retained ownership over the Kirtland Temple until March of 2024, when they sold it to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as part of a huge deal where they sold most of their historic sites and a lot of historic artifacts that they've had for a long time.
Oh, so how did they, or why did they decide to do a Kirtland Safety Society? Sorry, Kirtland Safety Society.
Well, it's a set of problems that aren't too distant from our time too, where you have a lot of people immigrating to Kirtland. Originally, the plan was to move everybody to Missouri, but persecutions in Missouri forced the church to leave the settlement that they had there. And when that happens, a lot of these new converts that have been commanded to gather, because in the early church, starting in section 37 of the Doctrine and Covenants, there's a commandment for the saints to gather together. So a lot of these church members are gathering to Kirtland because Missouri's not a pleasant option right then. And then, as well as now, most people that join the church aren't really wealthy. They're usually the poor, more humble sort, and they were very faithful and obedient. But when they come to Kirtland, it's a problem of we don't have enough money to provide for everybody. We don't have a way to get everybody a home and a job, and they were worried about that. So it's partially a problem that comes from growth and a lot of church members gathering to one particular area. In fact, in section 101, which happens right after all the troubles that occur in Missouri, the Lord actually warns them not to gather in haste or to gather before they're ready, but their enthusiasm kind of overtook their resources, and you've got all these converts in Kirtland that just don't have a way to provide for themselves or have shelter for their family. And so it was born out of a completely positive impulse, which was, hey, if we build a bank, we can have the capital to provide people with the funding they need to build homes. The construction of the temple was another huge factor in this. If we're going, adjusting for inflation and adjusting for the size of the church too, Kirtland, the temple there, is probably the most expensive building the church has ever built. Now, in 2025 money, it's thousands and not millions of dollars, but if you adjust it for the time and for the size of the church, which was still pretty small, around this time, it was a lot of money and a huge sacrifice for them to build that temple. And they're well rewarded. They have this massive spiritual outpouring where angels uh, sing alongside the saints, and Jesus Christ and Moses, Elijah, and Elias all appear in the Kirtland Temple. But it does leave the church in a considerable amount of debt. It's a sacrifice that they felt was worth it, but that adds to their problems too. They've got this big debt from building the temple. They've got a bunch of people moving in that don't have a means to provide for themselves. And a bank seemed to be the best solution at the time to the problems that they were having.
So it doesn't sound like it was a solution to their problems.
Well, I mean, on paper, it may have seemed like a way to try and solve it. The other choice that they have is to just leave people out of doors and with no means to take care of themselves. So they're desperate basically, and they're doing the best that they can, and they're seeking solutions on a number of different levels. If you're reading in the Doctrine and Covenants, for instance, one of the biggest contrasts you'll find is that in section 110. They are in the temple, and that's when the Savior appears along with those ancient prophets that I mentioned. Then flip the page and go to section 111. And section 111, they're in Salem, Massachusetts. And they're there because a guy who joined the church said that he knew that there was a gold treasure in a house in Massachusetts. And Joseph Smith and the other leaders of the church are in such dire straits financially that they take a chance and go all the way to Massachusetts, just on the offhand chance that they might be able to find this and use it to pay off the church's debts. Now, it doesn't work out. When they get there, they can't gain access to the house that's there. And then the guy's not even sure if it is the correct house. And in section 111, the Lord kind of gently rebukes them and says, he's going to help them on their journey, notwithstanding their folly. And they do spend a few meaningful weeks there and do some missionary work that results in a good-sized branch eventually in Salem. But that just kind of illustrates how they go from this spiritual high, which is the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, to this spiritual low, which is them having to deal with the expenses of building the temple and meeting the needs of this young growing church. So, I mean, it's a contrast, right, between seeing the Savior in the temple and then all of a sudden, like a lot of us do, you've had a spiritual high and then you have to kind of come back to reality and deal with the day-to-day of making the church work and making sure everybody was okay and taken care of.
So how long was the Kirtland Safety Society operational?
Oh, less than a year, really. I could pull up a timeline here if you want me to.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The Kirtland Safety Society is operative for less than a year, and really within 2 months of it opening, it's in trouble. And that's for a combination of reasons, some of which they have control over, and some of which they don't have a lot of control over, to be honest with you. So here's the timeline. They dedicate the Kirtland Temple in March 1836. April 3rd, 1836 is when they have that huge spiritual manifestation. That's when the Savior appears in the Kirtland Temple. By November of 1836, so the fall after the dedication, they drop articles for the Kirtland Bank, and then they open the Kirtland Bank in January of 1837. So it opens in January. By February, there's already trouble. People are already upset over the Safety Society, and then it gets worse as the year goes on. Finally, in November, so it's open for less than a year, the Safety Society closes. And again, there's a lot at play here, some of which they do have control over and some of which they don't. But it was kind of a perfect storm of bad circumstances that caused the bank to fail. So, I mean, the odds were probably against them from the beginning with the bank, but there were a few things happened that they just didn't have any control over, that sort of the timing was bad. The biggest being this, you might remember, back in 2008 or during the financial panic that surrounded the pandemic, that it looked like a lot of banks were going to fail. And when that happens, the federal government will intervene and stop the banks from failing. They'll come in and close the banks, or they'll, donate money that keeps the banks solvent so that we don't go into a major financial crisis. Well, what had happened back then is way out of Joseph Smith's hands. There was a bank that was meant to prop up the smaller banks throughout the country. It was called the Bank of the United States. But the president of the United States, who at the time is Andrew Jackson, hates the bank. And he thinks that it's wrong for the federal government to run a bank, and so he decides he's going to close the bank, which a lot of people don't like, and they fight against him. In fact, Andrew Jackson, who was an old soldier, always spoke in martial terms, and he at one point said, "I'm either going to kill that bank or that bank is going to kill me." And he closes the bank. And the fear and panic, because now there's no backup for all these little banks, causes what's known as the Panic of 1837, which results in hundreds of banks around the United States closing. So the Safety Society was already in trouble before the Panic of 1837 hit, but the Panic of 1837 is kind of what sealed the deal. And the Kirtland Bank wasn't really an aberration from the time. There were hundreds of banks throughout the United States that failed, and a real economic panic that caused a lot of people to sort of freak out. Now, that said, the Kirtland Bank does have a few things working against it too. A lot of the people in the surrounding communities did not like that all these religious refugees were gathering to one location. And they also didn't like that Kirtland was rapidly increasing in population and businesses were opening in Kirtland. And the local communities were a little bit worried that all these Latter-day Saints moving to Kirtland were going to take over the place and that they might lose business. So the next town over is Painesville. And there's a guy in Painesville named Gradison Newell who does not like the church and decides to attack the bank, essentially. Now, this isn't a violent attack or anything like that. It was a financial attack. So back then, the federal government didn't print money. You might notice if you pull out a dollar bill that dollar bill is just a piece of paper. It just means that you can go and exchange it to the federal government for whatever its value is. The federal government didn't print money like that until the Civil War. What happened in Joseph Smith's era is that your local bank would issue what's called a banknote. In fact, we still have a lot of these Kirtland Safety Society banknotes. And the banknote essentially meant that you could go into the bank and hand them the note, and they would give you $5 in gold or silver or anything like that. But just like a modern bank, if everybody pulls their money out of the bank at the same time, which sometimes happens in a financial panic, the bank will fail. So Gradison Newell actually organizes all of his buddies, and they purchase all the banknotes, and then they cash them in all at once, which causes the bank to have a serious lack of specie or gold or silver on hand to back up their banknotes with it. So maybe you remember that scene from It's a Wonderful Life, where the Depression hits and everybody runs in to pull their stuff out of the bank, and the bank manager has to get up and say, "Hey, your money's not here. It's in Bill's house," or something like that. That's what happens to the Kirtland Bank. But it's by design. The enemies of the church don't want the bank to succeed, and so they deliberately do this, and that's what kind of gets them in trouble too.
So then the saints that had their money in it, did they blame Joseph for that, or how did that happen?
Yeah, unfortunately they did. Okay, so I hope your listeners aren't like totally asleep because this has been an 1830s economics lesson so far. But the three factors are the Panic of 1837, the run on the banknotes, and finally, they didn't have permission to build a bank. They actually went to the Ohio State Legislature to get a banking charter, and they turned them down. And so the Kirtland Bank, if you look closely at some of the notes, is what's called an anti-bank, meaning it's a bank, but it's not a bank. It was kind of a legal loophole that they could use to establish the bank. And actually, just the past week at the Mormon History Association, somebody gave a presentation to ask, was it common for people to do this? Or was it dishonest for the church leaders to do this? He actually found out that it wasn't all that uncommon, to be honest with you. And the other thing that we found out was that the Ohio legislature didn't approve any bank charters that year because they were worried about what's happening with the Bank of the United States. So the bank's already kind of on shaky legal ground. This run happens, and then the Panic of 1837 sort of knocks the bottom out of everything. And a lot of church members were genuinely upset at the leadership of the church, who they personify in Joseph Smith. And that is what drives the large part of the apostasy that happens in Kirtland. The basic argument being, hey, if this guy is a prophet, then how come he didn't know that the bank was going to fail? Because Joseph Smith had been one of the key promoters in trying to get people in the community to invest in the bank, basically telling them, if we want to take care of everybody, we need the bank. And he may have overstepped a little bit in saying, the bank will succeed if we all pitch in and help. And then when the bank fails, it's one thing. It's one thing to have somebody offend you at church, but once money gets involved, people have intense feelings. And I don't think that's anything that's changed between now and the 1830s.
Actually, I just had a thought, because as we study history, we tend to base what we're studying and learning on our own life.
Yeah.
And we want to remember that back in those days, they didn't have the internet. In fact, they didn't even have a telegraph at the time. Communicating from city to city quite like we have now. And so banks were not in communication where you couldn't just go to an ATM on the other side of the country, even though your bank's 3,000 miles away, and pull out money. And so these issues that were happening in Kirtland, to the saints and the citizens of Kirtland, they probably didn't have anything they had no idea what was happening in Washington, D.C. And they probably actually had no idea of what was happening on a national level. They probably thought it was an isolated incident and it was only a Kirtland issue.
Yeah, it seems like it starts out that way. Now, they do have newspapers and national communication, but you're right. They would have been a few weeks behind everything that's happening in Washington, D.C. And it seems like that's the pattern, that really what starts the trouble is Grandison Newell, who's local. He's just in the next town over. And his run on the bank, which causes the bank to immediately be in trouble. And then as the year goes on, and in the summer of 1837, the panic about the national bank starts to spread. It's like any economic downturn we see, where part of it is there's really an issue happening, the stock market crashed or whatever. And part of it is people lose faith in the market or the bank or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then that fear just kind of turns into a vicious cycle where, if the bank's not stable, I'm going to pull my money out. Then the bank gets in more trouble until finally, like I said, in less than a year, the bank has to close. And that seriously tarnishes the reputation of the church and by extension, Joseph Smith too.
There was a faithful saint during that time named John Tanner, mm-hmm. who donated a substantial fortune for the temple, and he invested all of his money in the church bank, and basically when that fell, his fortune dwindled down to a mere $7.50.
Yeah, John Tanner is one of those tough stories to hear. Another one is John Johnson, who pops up a lot in the Doctrine and Covenants, because Joseph Smith lives on John Johnson's farm for about a year. In fact, he's on the farm when he receives the vision of the 3 degrees of glory. He does most of his Bible translation there. That's also where the mob attacks him, and John Johnson does his best to try and defend him. John Johnson loses a lot of his money when the bank fails too. And unfortunately, that causes John Johnson to lose his faith in the church. He doesn't leave Kirtland when the saints leave. And 2 of John Johnson's sons are apostles, Luke and Lyman Johnson, and we both lose them during this time, though Luke does come back a little bit later on. And there's a daughter, Nancy Johnson, who's married to another apostle, Orson Hyde, and she does stay faithful. So it's one of those things where it even splits, families into, because some people are so upset over the financial losses that they suffer. And again, I don't mean to downplay what they went through. It would be really hard to be a John Tanner and lose your entire fortune.
But John Tanner never turned.
Yeah.
He in fact remained very faithful, and years late, 9 years later, after he had donated a lot of that money for the Kirtland Temple, he handed Joseph one of those promissory notes.
Oh, is that right?
and and basically, in fact, there's a movie that came out a year ago, Treasures in Heaven.
Hmm.
I think
Yeah, I'm aware of it.
Yep. And he basically was called to go on a mission to the eastern United States, and he needed some money. But he went up to the prophet Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, met him on the street. He held the prophet's note for 2,000, loaned 9 years earlier, to redeem the Kirtland Temple farm. And in the course of the conversation, he handed the prophet his note. The prophet, not understanding what he meant by it, asked what he would have him do with it, and Father Tanner replied, "Brother Joseph, you are welcome to it." And that's when the prophet then laid his right hand heavily on Father Tanner's shoulder and said, "God bless you, Father Tanner. Your children shall never beg for bread." This prophecy was fulfilled and continued to be so. And it's important to remember the saints who, it was almost kind of a filtering of those who were really truly converted to those who, well, as long as things were good, they stayed true, but as soon as things got really difficult, they turned their back on the prophet and ran.
Yeah, yeah, and not an insignificant group of saints too. Like I said, a large number, and some of the key leaders in the church. In fact, I pulled this quote from Brigham Young. I really love this. Brigham Young says this. He can say, okay, so this is a speech he's giving later on in his life. He says, "I can tell the people that once in my life I felt a want of confidence in Brother Joseph Smith. Soon after I became acquainted with him. It was not concerning religious matters. It was not about his revelations, but it was in relation to his financiering, to his managing the temporal affairs which he undertook. A feeling came over me that Joseph was not right in his financial management, though I presume the feeling did not last 60 seconds, or perhaps not 30, but that feeling came on me once and once only, and from the time I first knew him to the day of his death." So even Brigham Young says, for about 30 or 60 seconds, I had serious doubts about Joseph Smith, but he emphasizes, I didn't have doubts about him as a spiritual leader. I had doubts about him as a financial leader. And that sort of sets the pattern too, that Brigham Young is hurt financially by this. He invests largely in the bank, but he's able to recover quickly. In fact, this is, can I go on here with what he said? He said, "I repented of my unbelief, and that too very suddenly. I repented about as quickly as I committed the error. It was not for me to question whether Joseph was dictated by the Lord at all times and under all circumstances or not. He was called of God. God dictated him. And if I had a mind to leave him to himself and let him commit an error, that was no business of mine. It was not my prerogative to call him in question with regard to any act in his life. He was God's servant and not mine." And so Brigham Young kind of has to go through this process of saying, hey, I don't know if he's always inspired, but I know that he is the servant of God. And if he's made an error, that's not really a reason to doubt him. I know that he's a true prophet. He's God's servant, and he's not my servant. So a lot of people were looking to Joseph kind of for their temporal salvation. And Brigham Young made the correct move of kind of saying, hey, he's never led me astray when it comes to my spiritual salvation. That's what really matters. So if the bank failed, that doesn't remove his calling as a prophet of God. And later on, Brigham does become one of the most important, everybody knows who he is and how important he is, but it's because he's able to kind of work through this this miniature faith crisis, this 30-second faith crisis that he deals with.
Now, have you heard of the story? And I'm looking at the timing because John Taylor was converted up in Toronto, Canada.
Yeah.
In March of 1836.
Yeah.
And I heard that he came down to Kirthland and met with Parley P. Pratt. And during that time, Parley P. Pratt had that same doubts of the prophet Joseph Smith, even though Parley P. Pratt was one of the original apostles and he had had so many beautiful experiences while he was out preaching the gospel. Was it because of the Kirtland Safety Bank falling that Parley P. Pratt doubted the Joseph?
That's one thing. There's a couple things actually, and I want to mention Parley P. Pratt is one of my heroes.
Me too.
But this does affect him. Now, it's one of several things. One, Parley loses a lot of money
Yes.
in the bank, and then he's kind of roughly treated by Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon tells him he has to pay back his debts. The other big thing is that Parley's wife dies. So Parley's wife dies in childbirth during this time too. And this, combined with everything with the finances, and then Parley himself gets physically ill while this is happening, cause him to sort of get bitter, and he gives a speech where he rails on Joseph Smith, like totally doubts his leadership. In fact, this is the way Parley describes it in his own words. He said, after I had returned from Canada, and by the way, he's on his mission in Canada. That's where he converts John Taylor, future president of the church. He says, there were jarrings and discords in the church in Kirtland, and many fell away and became enemies and apostates. There were also envyings, lying, strifes, and divisions, which caused much trouble and sorrow. And at this time, I was overcome by the same spirit in great measure, and it seemed as if the very powers of darkness which war against the saints were let loose upon me. So he's in the middle of all this when John Taylor shows up in Kirtland. And John Taylor is this, little British convert to the church. He goes up to Parley and says, hey, I've gathered to Kirtland. And Parley basically tells him, I'm sorry you came all this way. Joseph is a fallen prophet. If he ever was a prophet, you wasted your time. And this is where the convert gets to confront the missionary. So this is what is written in John Taylor's biography. John Taylor gets right up in his face and says, I'm surprised to hear you speak so, Brother Parley. Before you left Canada, you bore a strong testimony to Joseph Smith being a prophet of God and the truth of the work he has inaugurated. And you said you knew these things by revelation and the gift of the Holy Ghost. Now, Brother Parley, it is not man that I am following, but the Lord. The principles you taught led me to him, and now I have the same testimony that you then rejoiced in. If the work was true 6 months ago, it's true today. If Joseph Smith was then a prophet, he is now a prophet. And John Taylor and a couple other church members are able to kind of pull Parley back from the ledge and keep him in the church. And they become best friends. They even write each other poems on their 50th birthdays, which isn't a thing a lot of men do nowadays, but maybe more should. So it's a siege of darkness. That's the way Brigham Young refers to it. It's just a really, really rough time in the church, to where you have somebody, Parley P. Pratt, who, is a convert from the year the church was organized, who's literally part of the first mission in the church that Oliver Cowdery leads, and is a stalwart, but just has too much for him. And if it hadn't been for John Taylor and a few other people, we might have lost Parley during this time as well.
Thank you for sharing that quote. That was the quote that I actually wanted to share, and so thank you so much. That was perfect.
Yeah, happy to help.
Because I love the fact that John Taylor said that if it was true 6 months ago, it's true now.
Yeah,
because
and that's an attitude we have to have today as well, right? I mean, sometimes things happen, and it can be, small personal things like you don't like your bishop or someone in the church is mean to you. Angeline and I were talking before we turned on record about how we both have children with disabilities, and I have a son that has autism, and he was pretty hard to control when he was younger. And I remember a guy in my ward came up to me after sacrament meeting and said, why can't you control your kid? Are you some kind of terrible parent or something? And I was pretty offended. Like, I almost hauled off and decked the guy in the chapel. But instead, I just said, do you know he has autism? And the guy didn't back down. He wasn't that sort of guy. In fact, I never got an apology from this guy. But a couple weeks later, he came and said, I printed out some things on autism that maybe you want to read. And I mean, I could have walked out the door that day and never come back, been like, but people at church don't understand our family, what we're going through. But, I forgave. I can't say I wasn't angry for a little while. And that kind of thing does drive people out of the church. Now imagine a major financial deal where, your church leader's involved, and the church isn't huge during this time. We're talking it's about the size of a modern steak. It's easy to see why a lot of people fell away, but it's also inspirational to see people like John Taylor and Brigham Young who realized, I'm not going to let this affect my testimony of the gospel. There's finance, and then there's the gospel. And they also had to learn a tough lesson that we have to learn too, which is the prophets are human beings. They sometimes make errors in judgment and make mistakes, and that doesn't remove their prophetic calling, but it can be really hard on a person's faith sometimes.
Yeah, that definitely, and Heber C. Kimball was another one that was solid,
Yeah.
and John Tanner, and so many, Benjamin F. Johnson.
Yeah, that's true. Of the original 12, Joseph Smith said there were only two that never raised their voice against me, and that was Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young. Yeah. And Heber C. Kimball actually talks about how he kind of got through this. He said, this order of things, meaning the trouble with the Kirthland Bank, increased during the winter to such an extent that a man's life was in danger the moment he spoke in defense of the prophet of God. So he's saying if you even stood up and said, hey, it's not Joseph's fault, or hey, Joseph's a prophet, your life was literally in danger. And he said this, the only consolation I had was in bending my knees continually before my Father in heaven and asking him to sustain me and preserve me from falling into snares and from betraying my brethren as others had done. So Heber's got it right too, to where when things get bad, he kneels down and he prays. And he asks for strength that he won't fall into the same kind of problems that the people around him are falling into.
Yeah, a month ago, I was in Kirtland and touring the Kirtland Temple. And it was a elderly couple that was giving us the tour. It was an elder and sister Call.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, I said, are you related to Anson Call? And he said, yes, I am the second great-grandson of Anson Call. And then he says, but you need to talk to my wife. She is the second great-granddaughter of Heber C. Kimball.
Oh, is that right?
And so they were the missionary couple that gave us the tour of the Kirtland Temple. And when we got to the top floor, back into the I can't remember what the very top floor, back room, it's called. It's the School of the Prophets, I believe. Or it's where they taught there in the Kirtland Temple. Yep. Sister Call basically said, and she started to cry, but she said, I'm so thankful today to have in our presence a descendant of the prophet Joseph and his wife Emma. And she said, my great-great-grandfather was one of two men of the original apostles that did not turn on Joseph. And it meant a lot to her. And I just want to throw out to the viewers that for all of you who are descendants of those early prophets and apostles and pioneers of the Restoration, our family loves you. And we appreciate you. Thank you.
I met Elder Call. I know who you're talking about, actually. Because I was in Kirtland about a year ago, and I'm going to go back in another week or two here. And him and his wife are both great. And I'm going to add, too, my wife is also a descendant of Heber C. Kimball. And it's a huge blessing, for them to have a faithful ancestor. I myself come from a long line of apostasy in the church. But my wife, is descendant of this apostle, and it's really, really amazing to hear his story. In fact, I'll recommend everybody out there to get The Life of Heber C. Kimball by Orson F. Whitney, which is one of the best books on church history anybody can read. Heber C. Kimball was just an amazing guy who's a little underappreciated today.
Well, just so you know, we appreciate you. We appreciate your wife and her family and your ancestors.
Well, thanks very much. Same to you.
All right.
I was going to ask you about Warren Parish and what happened with a lot of the confusion with him?
Yeah, so Warren Parrish is a tough case. He's actually very close to Joseph Smith. He's one of Joseph Smith's scribes. In fact, we sometimes quote Warren Parrish when we're talking about the Book of Abraham because he was one of Joseph's scribes during that time. But he's affiliated with the Kirtland Bank, and he may have done some dishonest things. It's tough to say. Until the 1970s, when we got the Kirtland Bank records, there were all kinds of accusations that Joseph Smith had done something dishonest. I'm happy to report that the Kirtland Bank records, which became available in the 70s, indicate that Joseph Smith didn't do anything dishonest and probably lost more money than anybody else did. But Warren Parrish becomes bitter against Joseph Smith and sort of becomes the leader of the opposition. And unfortunately, some of the best families in the church are swept up in this movement. It's tough because when you open up the Book of Mormon, for instance, and you see the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, everybody is a Smith or a Whitmer. The only exception is Martin Harris. Martin Harris is kind of the weird uncle of the Restoration, but Oliver Cowdery is actually married to a Whitmer daughter. And Hiram Page, who's the other one whose last name isn't Whitmer, is married to Catherine Whitmer. So all the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, except for Martin Harris, come from either the Smith family or the Whitmer family. And unfortunately, the Kirtland apostasy is where there starts to be a rift between the two. And we don't talk about this as much as we should, but it's because some people, like Warren Parrish, try to get David Whitmer to replace Joseph Smith as the head of the church. And there's a reason why they do that. In 1835, Joseph Smith actually blessed David Whitmer that he would be the head of the church if anything ever happened to Joseph. So Joseph is the stake president in Kirtland, and David is the stake president in Missouri. And they actually bring David Whitmer to Kirtland, and they hold a meeting inside the Kirtland temple to try and sustain David Whitmer as the leader of the church. And this is because of want of confidence in Joseph Smith over the bank, and Joseph Smith became very ill for a few weeks too. And then the meeting.
I ask what about the time frame when that happened?
Yeah. Let me pull up the time frame here. So I think the meeting happens in February. So not long after the bank opens, like about a month after the bank opens, that's when they hold this meeting. In fact, let me give you the exact date here. Okay, so February 1837, that's when the meeting in the Kirtland Temple is held, and they try to invite David Whitmer to lead the church. Brigham Young is at the meeting, and he later recalls that during the meeting, they're basically asking for consensus, and Brigham's there, and because he's an apostle, he'd be a major addition to their cause. Brigham Young says this in a later discourse. He says, "I rose up and in a plain and forcible manner told them that Joseph was a prophet. And I knew it. They might rail and slander him as much as they pleased. They could not destroy the appointment of a prophet of God. They could only destroy their own authority, cut the thread that bound them to the prophet and to God, and sink themselves to hell." So he gives this speech, and according to Brigham Young, after it's over, this older guy who used to be a professional boxer stands up and challenges Brigham to a boxing match, and then the whole meeting just kind of devolves into chaos. Now, in the months after that, Joseph Smith does try to reconcile with the Whitmers, especially David, and David actually stays in the church for almost a full year after this. But in March of 1838, David Whitmer is excommunicated, and unfortunately, he takes Oliver Cowdery with him, and then the entire Whitmer family, all those Book of Mormon witnesses, leave the church, and none of them ever deny their witness of the Book of Mormon. And some of them, like Oliver Cowdery, do eventually return to the church. But just last week, I was in Missouri and visited David Whitmer's grave. And David Whitmer dies outside the church. He actually writes a big document in 1887 where he sustains his testimony of the Book of Mormon, but criticizes Joseph Smith and his leadership. And then on David Whitmer's headstone, I had some students with me. The words, "The record of the Jews and the record of the Nephites are one, truth is eternal." That's etched into his headstone. So seems like to the last day of his life, he had a testimony of Joseph Smith as a prophet when it came to the Book of Mormon. But some of this stuff that happened in Kirtland, unfortunately, soured him on Joseph Smith's leadership and causes it so that he eventually leaves the church and unfortunately never comes back.
Wow. Um, and will you remind me again that the relationship between Warren Parrish and David Whitmer?
So Warren Parrish is just one of those dissenters that wants David Whitmer to take over the church. So effectively, the church is only about 7 years old at this point, and a lot of people still had a testimony of the divine origins of the church, but they believed Joseph Smith had fallen, and their evidence was that the bank had failed. What's that?
Is that just because of the bank, or could that also have been because of like the polygamy? Because that's about when the polygamy stuff came out, right?
That's happening around this time too. We don't know how many people in the general church knew about that. We know Oliver Cowdery knows. And that's kind of a unique angle too, is that when Oliver Cowdery is put on trial to be excommunicated, one of the charges is that he accused Joseph Smith of committing adultery with Fanny Alger. But Joseph Smith actually testifies in Oliver's trial. This sounds weird because in our mind, Joseph Smith should be the one presiding at the excommunication. But the way the rules are in Section 107 is because Oliver's a member of the First Presidency, the presiding bishop presides at his hearing. Joseph Smith actually speaks as a witness in the hearing. And you can go back and read through the minutes, but he actually sort of defends Oliver Cowdery, sort of saying, Oliver isn't accusing me of committing adultery. That charge shouldn't be leveled against him. He actually says, I spoke with him about this business with Miss Alger, and we came to an understanding. So it seems like Oliver was upset with Joseph Smith. He writes a letter basically saying that he didn't like what was happening. But it seems like by the next year, Joseph and Oliver had met together, and Joseph had probably explained the principles of plural marriage to him. Because there's some sources that say that Oliver Cowdery entered into plural marriage or tried to during the Kirtland period as well. So it's a little muddy. A lot of the stuff surrounding plural marriage and in Kirtland is muddier than we want it to be honest with you. And some of the sources contradict each other, but that might have been a factor too, actually. And that might have involved Emma. Now, again, a lot of the sources here have been badly distorted and don't come from Emma. And so I'd be really cautious with anything about her during this period too.
Have you discovered in all your research instances where quotes were utilized but misquoted? Meaning, for instance, a person sits there and they'll talk maybe 30 minutes, but the only thing that gets passed down and quoted is 30 seconds of the conversation, where the other 29 minutes they actually were saying something completely different than what that quote meant.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And that's why projects like the Joseph Smith papers are so wonderful, is you can go back and see everything in context if we have the context. Some things we don't. But yeah, I mean, a lot of times people that attack the church, for instance, will quote a guy named William McClellan, who's a member of the 12. He leaves the church during the Kirtland apostasy. But William McClellan writes this letter to Joseph Smith III, Joseph Smith's son, saying that Emma caught Joseph and Fanny Alger together in a barn during this time. And unfortunately, that's badly out of context. First of all, McClellan's not even there when this happens. Second of all, McClellan writes a second letter where he clarifies that Emma hadn't caught Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger together physically, that she had walked in while the sealing ceremony was happening. And other sources like Mosiah Hancock confirm that Joseph Smith actually sought out Fanny Alger's parents, obtained their permission. We don't have Emma's perspective on any of this because she doesn't say anything. But the other big problem, too, is in that letter where McClellan makes those charges, he also says some other stuff that's just not true. that we can prove isn't true. And so it kind of cast the whole thing into doubt. But so many of my students have just heard like that one excerpt from the letter where McClellan says something like Emma walked into the barn and caught them in the very act, and assumed that it was much worse than it actually was, and also assumed that McClellan was some kind of eyewitness when he wasn't. He wasn't even present when that was happening. But unfortunately, that's the part that's been copied and pasted all over the place, and that happens a lot with historical sources too, where people will just make a charge like, "Oh, Joseph Smith conned a bunch of people out of money," and they don't do the legwork to understand, well, what was actually happening with the bank, and what were the reasons behind the bank, and did Joseph Smith actually make any money out of this whole deal? He didn't. He lost more money than anybody else did. There's an old saying from Winston Churchill where he said, a lie can make it halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. And that unfortunately happens a lot with Joseph Smith, because people just say things and they don't contextualize them or even analyze the source that they're drawing from. And that causes a lot of problems because it requires genuine, effort and work to find the truth. But we live in a day and age when, a single phrase just runs out of control and causes a lot of damage to people spiritually before they are able to sit down and examine the truth. So we have a podcast, me and my partner, Scott Woodward, where we, we'll spend 6 or 7 episodes talking about plural marriage. And we probably need more time than that just to properly contextualize it and analyze the sources. But sometimes our podcast is competing with a 30-second TikTok that just makes a bunch of inflammatory charges and doesn't have to be fact-checked. And that's too bad. So I would caution anybody before you hear anything, especially about the Kirtland Bank or Kirtland polygamy, to make sure you don't gallop off basically before you sit down and say, okay, who said this and why did they say this and what was actually going on? Because we can't answer every single question, but a lot of the documents that have become easily and readily available do confirm that Joseph Smith was doing the best he could, that he made mistakes, but he wasn't being dishonest with anybody, that he was trying as hard as he could to help the people in the church that didn't have the resources to take care of themselves.
And now we clear up the kind of misconception that the Kirtland Safety Society was established by revelation from God versus it was just something that Joseph thought might be a good idea.
I mean, and I also wouldn't place all the blame just on Joseph Smith. I would say the community leaders of Kirtland. Now, Joseph is the leader. He's the prophet and he's the stake president, and the buck stops with him, right? The Kirtland Bank wouldn't have been approved without his say-so, but it was something that they came up with together. And I mean, Joseph Smith doesn't have a degree in finance. Brigham Young at one point talks a lot about how hard it was for Joseph Smith to try and provide for his family, but also be the prophet, because people would leverage his ecclesiastical role against him. Brigham's actually talking about Joseph Smith's store in Kirtland, that somebody would come in and say, hey, I want these boots, but I don't have the money to pay for them. And Joseph Smith would say, well, I can't sell them to you then. And then the guy would say something like, well, I'll just up and apostatize. And so Joseph Smith would give him the boots, and that rinse and repeat, that the story happened over and over again, that it was very, very difficult for him to be a financial leader, just a businessman in Kirtland, and also be the spiritual leader of the saints in Kirtland. Those roles are just sometimes hard to reconcile. And again, it's a normal part of life, but it's unfair sometimes to pin a lot of this on Joseph Smith when he wasn't the sole decision maker. And I don't know if he had the financial knowledge to know whether or not it would work. He was just sort of an optimist by nature. And I think sort of saw the sunny side of everything around him and had faith that if they tried this could cause the temporal salvation of the church. So, I mean, yeah, he's the leader of the church, but I wouldn't place all the blame on him either. It's a community effort to build the bank.
Brigham Young made a quote once comparing Joseph and Hiram. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah.
And I can't quote it exactly, but it was along the lines of Joseph Smith believed in the man's potential, where Hiram pretty much was practical and logical, and said he's a snake. And Joseph's like, well, but he has potential.
Yeah, 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 and that is, that story just happens over and over again, where Joseph Smith just sees the good in a person or a situation, and he's kind of an optimist throughout his entire life. There's that famous quote where he's with his cousin George A. Smith, and his cousin's a little discouraged, and Joseph Smith says, "Don't ever give up hope, George A. If I was in the deepest coal pit of Nova Scotia and all the Rocky Mountains were piled on top of me, I would hold on, exercise faith, and I would come out on top." That's just kind of his attitude. And every episode in his life sort of illustrates Joseph Smith going in thinking the best possible thing is going to happen.
Best possible scenario.
Yeah, he's an optimist, which
Yeah.
I think you would have to be to do the things that he did. Unfortunately, I'm an optimist too, and sometimes people take advantage of that trust, or sometimes things just don't turn out the way that you want them to, and then you kind of have to deal with that. And this is one of those situations where, yeah, everything, a perfect storm, just kind of came together, and that caused the fall of the Kirtland Bank, which leads to the apostasy of a large number of members of the church, which, like I said, we're still sort of dealing with today.
Yeah.
We're still recovering from what happened then.
My mom calls that the law of balances, where you have blessings and everything's going great, and then you're going to have equal opposition at the same level
Yeah.
to test, to see, can you weather through this storm?
Yeah. My wife and I, one of our earliest callings was to be temple prep teachers. We loved that calling. But I swear, we had to get to the point to where we would sit down with a person before they were getting ready to go through the temple and say, the temple is going to be a spiritual high for you, but everything that can possibly go wrong is going to go wrong the 24 hours before you go to the temple. And it was everything from a guy who softball was his entire life, broke his arm the day before they were supposed to go to the temple, to this nice little couple that had a little 3-year-old girl. She had hot oil fall on her head and burn her. And it was completely miraculous because they took her to the emergency room and she was totally fine. I have no idea how it worked, but it was a good thing that we had warned them. Like, the 24 hours before you go to the temple, things are going to get crazy, but just hold on and exercise faith, and you're going to make it. And it's still that way. I swear my wife and I only fight when we're getting ready to go to the temple because it's such an important thing. And I think the adversary knows that. And so he throws roadblocks and obstacles in our way, and man, he is ruthless. Sometimes
is ruthless.
he
Yes.
gets in some cheap shots to get what he wants.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I think that's, well, Joseph also, it was a refiner's fire. Jesus Christ experienced that same. Friends turning on him, or those, saying, "Oh, too easy. This is too easy. I'm not going to believe this." And they would just, turn and walk away. And many came and heard the words of life, but so many also turned their backs. And I think that was also part of the refiner's fire for Joseph, to go through all of these experiences, including the failure of the bank, because he learned. And when they got to Nauvoo, he was able to take the lessons learned from Kirtland to propel Nauvoo to what it became within such a short period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's not just Joseph Smith, right? When you were talking about the words of life, it made me think of that poignant moment in the 4 Gospels when Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then they show up the next day expecting more bread. And Jesus says something like, well, the bread that I have to give you, if you eat, you'll never hunger again. And when they realize he's not talking about giving them actual bread, a lot of them turned around, and the Savior kind of poignantly turns to Peter and the other apostles and says, will you go away also? And Peter says, Master, wherewith would we go? Thou hast the words of life. And again, it's just one of those things where anciently in Joseph Smith's time, and even in our time, we go through trials, and sometimes we have to genuinely ask ourselves, why am I doing this? And if the answer is anything other than I believe in and have faith in Jesus Christ, it can be tough to stay. But if we have faith in Jesus Christ, if we're someone like Brigham Young or Heber C. Kimball or John Taylor, we'll find within us the strength to stay amidst all the difficulties that we face.
Yeah, thank you. That was a beautiful share. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I think that comes with the territory of following God. It's just going to be fraught with challenges. So,
It's not easy.
no, it's not. And not
But it
popular.
is worth it.
Yeah, it is worth it. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So would you talk a little bit about what people say that Joseph prophesied that the Kirtland Safety Society would be successful?
Well, Joseph made a couple statements while they were gathering funds for the Kirtland Safety Society, where he basically said, I prophesy that the bank will be our salvation. Now, again, it's possible that he just flat out made an error here. It's also possible that these promises were contingent upon the faithfulness of the people. As you can see, there's not a long span of time between when the bank opened and when people were trying to literally remove Joseph Smith as the president of the church. It's January to February, basically. So they had about a month in them before they started to turn on Joseph, and it probably started to happen before then. And so I'm comfortable saying Joseph Smith did prophesy that the bank would be a means of their temporal salvation, but prophecies don't always come true. They're usually contingent based on a person's faithfulness. And in addition to that, Joseph Smith may have made an error here too. It seems like the conditions weren't the best for a bank to exist during this time, but he's doing the best he can with the resources he has to try and help everybody. So I don't think that he was lying to them. I think he genuinely believed that if they were united, they worked together, the bank would be a means of providing for people and providing a temporal salvation. Unfortunately, it just didn't work out in this case for a number of reasons.
So during that time that it was operational, were there positive outcomes from it? From that short period of time that it functioned, was there anything that good that came from it?
That's a great question because you never hear anything positive, at least financially, that came from the bank. It seems like the bank struggled from the moment it opened to the moment it closed, and the repercussions lasted for years and years after. But if there was a positive that came out of it, it did allow Joseph Smith to sort of take the measure of his friends and get a feel for who would be there. Like I've got to imagine that Brigham Young, who was not the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles during this time, Brigham Young was third down the line. The original president of the Quorum of the 12 is Thomas B. Marsh, and then David Patton, and then Brigham Young. Thomas B. Marsh sticks around for another year. He apostatizes during the troubles in Missouri, which happened about a year after the Kirtland Safety Society. David Patton is killed during the struggles that happened in Missouri. And then Brigham Young becomes the leader of the Quorum of the 12. But Joseph Smith, over the following years, invests more and more trust in Brigham Young and the 12, and then makes those statements, like I said, where he says, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball were the only two members of the 12 that never turned against me. That leads us to where we are, to where when Joseph Smith dies in 1844, everybody looks to Brigham Young because he's already been the person that's guided the church through several periods of crisis in Kirtland, in Missouri, and then he's a missionary to thousands of converts in England. That's one positive outcome that comes out of this, is that Joseph Smith learns to place greater trust and sort of learns who he can trust. But there's also some remarkable stories of forgiveness, too. Frederick G. Williams was one of Joseph Smith's counselors in the first presidency, and he's removed from the first presidency during the Kirtland apostasy, but they reconcile. Frederick Williams dies in the faith. A number of the apostles that are removed from the Quorum of the 12 during this time come back. The most prominent is Luke Johnson, who comes back into the church. He's never made an apostle again, but he dies in the faith, I think in Tooele, Utah. And so the positive outcomes tend to be spiritual, to where people have their faith tested and pass the test, and to where others who were more fair weather, I guess, kind of came into the open too. That the refiner's fire, which has become even more intense. What happens in Kirtland pales in contrast to what happens in Missouri the next year, where there's physical violence, where Joseph Smith is placed into Liberty Jail, and then down the road, the trials that happened in Nauvoo and the trials of the Trek West. You can trace a line between those that stayed faithful in Kirtland during the financial crisis, and then that stayed with Joseph Smith and with Brigham Young through all those other trials too.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
That's just beautiful information, and I really appreciate your insight as well. In fact, just so you know, I do enjoy your podcasts.
Oh, thanks.
Quite. I've watched quite a few of them, and I've learned quite a bit from them. And my mom and I have some questions for you, but we'll do them on the side because they're not concerning the bank in Kirtland.
Oh yeah, your mom and I have talked on the phone together because she had some questions, but I was happy to help her. She's a wonderful lady.
Yeah, so she came in a minute ago, and I think she wanted to jump in, but then she walked back out.
Casey, is there anything that you would like to add that you think would be important for us to know?
Just that these periods of apostasy do tend to come in cyclical ways in the church. A few years ago, Marlon Jensen, who was the church historian, was giving a speech and just doing a Q&A, and he said something like, I feel like we're going through a Kirtland apostasy again. And I'll just say this, it's never going to be easy to be a Latter-day Saint. I just don't think that's part of the deal, right? And I do believe that the gospel has caused me to have a happier life and fewer trials than I would have otherwise. But it doesn't mean no trials. And it doesn't mean that things are always going to work out. I won't name any names, but there's been a couple times when I have gone into a business venture with other Latter-day Saints thinking, hey, we're all good people and we're all part of the church, and it just didn't work out. And that is really tough. But you've got to remember that God sometimes teaches us through our successes, but we often learn more from our failures. So again, a failure like the Kirtland Bank isn't always a sign of God's disfavor either. It's like David said, a refiner's fire, where sometimes God puts us into the midst of difficulty to kind of burn out the impurities that exist within us. And again, I think the church has been through some tight spots in the past. This is one of the tightest, the Kirtland Bank. We've got some tight spots to go through in the future. And the Lord allows us to experience those trials to sort of help us know who we are and what we're really made of and why we do what we do. If we stay faithful, we'll pass the test and we'll get the blessings that the Lord has in store for us. But it might be a while before those blessings come.
What came to my mind in that is many who have gone on missions and spent 2 years or a year and a half and have come home and later on fallen away. The message of John Taylor to Parley P. Pratt rings true. If it was true then, it is still true now.
Yeah.
And what I would like to add is, what has changed since then?
Yeah. That's a great point and a good lesson for us to all remember, because we've all had spiritual experiences, right? It's just they sometimes become hard to remember when we're in the midst of really serious trials. And I get it. I won't fault anybody that has had their faith waver because they've gone through serious trials. But if you hold on and you do exercise faith, usually there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And sometimes it comes more quickly than we think it's going to.
And they talk about we all are going to have to go through the refiner's fire.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things that we're all going to have to get down and dirty and figure out which way we're going to go and go through that hardships. But then, Elder Holland and his talk, it's always going to be my favorite talk about the lemonade. You know, Lord, don't let me go through anything hard or anything, but let me sip lemonade with all those that have. You know, I think it's important and I think you wouldn't feel like you earned that when you get to the other side, and that you need to be able to earn that lemonade and sip with everybody that's been through those hard things.
I had a companion on my mission who kneeled down one day and said, "Please bless us with trials so that we can progress." And I about smacked him upside the head, and said, "You don't have to pray for trials, okay? They're going to come no matter what we do. This isn't an easy job." But he was probably right. Like, if you're interested in growth, adversity is a great way to grow. It's just not a really pleasant way to grow, but it does help you get better if you weather it in the right way. Sometimes that Sonny Smith optimism is not all that welcome, is it? You just want people to tell you, "I'm sorry, it's terrible," but they're usually right too. Right?
Yes,
it usually does work out.
But I had a moment about a year ago where they were starting a project, and they said, "We would like to offer to have you be the treasurer for this project." And I said, "Oh," and he's like, "Yeah, we've talked to you a lot. We think you'd be a good fit." And I said, "Well, the answer's no. And here is straight up one: is I don't want to put myself in that position. Two, historically, finances in the Smith family has never been a good idea or a great investment." And he laughed and he said, "Oh, that's a pretty good comeback right there."
You've got 200 years distance from this, so I think you're a good investment. So
Well,
I'll just go on record and say that.
if it's a spiritual investment, I would probably lay my bets down on it. but on finances, on something that has nothing to do with the plan of salvation, the salvation of mankind, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the atonement of Jesus Christ, you can trust that the Smith family is going to stand with you in those things.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
I want
Amen
you to know that. Just like with your wife, as her ancestor stood by mine and did not turn his back on him, we, the family of Joseph and Emma in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, will stand with you here and now, one in faith, one in unity, and one in testimony. And together we will turn and face our Savior, Jesus Christ.
Amen. Amen to everything you just said.
Yes. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, Casey. This has been such a pleasure, and we hope to have you on again, and maybe even bring Brother Woodward on with you one of these days.
Oh, yeah, anytime. I think Scott and I are always willing to sit down and talk about church history, especially. We can't get people to shut us up, to be honest with you.
Well, there's so much to learn. It'll never be a boring topic.
No, and we'll never run out of things to talk about is the thing.
No,
too,
definitely not. But thank you, everybody, for joining us for another episode of Emma's Pearls with Casey Griffiths and Angeline and myself. Keep strong, and remember to always step back and look at the big picture and understand that Heavenly Father is in charge. And the atonement of Jesus Christ is real, and it will heal everything that has ever been broken.
Amen.
Thank you.